Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
Erev Tov, good evening to you all. So excited that you are here. And I'm really excited that you are here. We're in for a real treat. And I'm going to try to be as inconspicuous as possible because many of you get a chance to hear from me more than you want to. But this is a rare opportunity to hear from two real luminaries in the Jewish world, the power of whose minds is only surpassed by the extent of their menschlichkeit and their goodness and what they're trying to accomplish in the Jewish world and the world beyond. Just to read you a little bit about who they are, and then we'll get right into it. Abigail Pogrebin is the author of My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew, a National Jewish Book Award finalist, and also Stars of David, Prominent Jews Talk About Being Jewish. She's written for The Atlantic, The Forward, and Tablet, and moderates conversations for the Streicker Center and the Jewish Broadcasting Service. And she and I had a very intense 4 days together about 6 years ago when we were on the Encounter program, spending 4 days amidst Palestinian residents in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, and that forged a friendship that I'm still grateful for to this very day. Welcome, Abby. Rabbi Dov Linzer is the President and Rosh HaYeshiva of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, the rabbinical school in New York that is ordaining rabbis into an open, moderate Orthodoxy, promoting inclusive Orthodoxy. He's written for the Forward, Tablet, and the New York Times, published widely, hosted highly popular Torah podcasts, and has a tremendous following in the world of Torah scholarship and ideas. You two are a bit of an odd couple. And you own that quite loudly and proudly in the book itself and in the promotion about the book. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the story about how you became friends, how you started studying Torah together, and those are not the same things. One can be either one without the other, and so the fact that both emerged in your relationship is really fascinating. Bring us into this narrative. Abby, why don't you start?
Okay. First of all, it's great to be here, and thank you all for coming out on a weekday night in a very intense week.
What are you talking about?
Nothing happened. And without fangirling, I'm just such a huge fan of your rabbi and Rabbi Schatz, both of them I know, but particularly Adam. When we traveled together, it was 2018, so Pittsburgh happened just as we had arrived basically in Israel, so the confluence of events was pretty intense, and I think we're a much darker place now in many ways. But just basically we are the odd couple, not out of a shtick or a device. It's the truth. It's a very unlikely friendship and a very unlikely havruta. And I think that the genuineness of that has come through, and it is kind of how this all evolved, which is we basically met at a Jewish conference, which is not that exciting, Jewish conferences as they go. But this one was kind of an unusual one. It was convened by the Jewish Week. Some of you may know that newspaper. Sadly, it doesn't exist quite as a newspaper anymore. There are still columnists and an online presence. But they used to convene something called The Conversation. Did you ever go, Adam?
I read about it.
Yeah, and it was basically they would invite clergy and journalists and not-for-profit heads and kind of put us all in a Baltimore retreat and say, what's on your mind? What's keeping you up at night? We kind of guided the conversation based on where we had Spilkus. And Dov and I just kept landing in the same breakout sessions. We sort of gravitated to the same topics. And I'm a little bit of a teacher groupie. It's part of why Adam is now in my go-to stable as a journalist when I'm working on a project and I think about who's going to make these ideas come alive. And Dov was really just very challenging in every conversation that we were in. So we stayed in touch. And when I worked on my second book, which was a deep dive into the Jewish holidays, really wanting to understand the scaffolding of a Jewish year, kind of from soup to nuts, what is the origin of Shmini Atzeret? Not every...
No one knows.
No one knows. Exactly. And he was my final reader. I interviewed over 62 rabbis and scholars for that book, and he kicked the tires on the Judaism in its final read before publication, and we ended up having even sort of a deeper kind of exchange that was, very much about minutia. I'd call him and say, this feather that you're supposed to use to clean the cabinet before Passover, where did that come from? Like, who started the feather thing? And he would say, let me get back to you, like in 4 hours. And he would come up with all of the, the layers of both meaning and rabbinic kind of commentary on this ritual. And there were times where we were running out of time because it was Shabbat, and he obviously Shomer Shabbos, and I would say, oh my gosh, I'm going to hit my deadline. And I'll never forget the thing he said to me on one of the many Fridays I was panicking. He said, basically, Hineni, I'm here. Like, I will be there on Sunday when I get back online, and we'll continue this conversation. And it's just a metaphor in a way for how we've been talking ever since. It was his idea that we talk about Torah out loud, that we bring some of what we had experienced in our back and forth together to a larger audience, and not because we wanted to perform or think that our conversations are so brilliant, but because what we think is so much missing is talking across difference, and particularly about the foundational book of our people.
Dov?
So one of the things I'll say that's amazing about Abby, and I don't think I've said this yet in the various events.
Oh, no.
No, but when she talks about how when we met at the conference, Abby is just usually affirming and enthusiastic, and it's really good in terms of positive feedback when I'm sharing all of my brilliant ideas. And then, but in addition, then she's asked like really tough follow-up questions and challenges me. And, normally I get one or the other or neither, but very rarely do I get them both combined. So it made it, that's, I think, when we first met, what made it such a pleasure to really be in chavruta. Was a type of a chavruta already, with somebody who both appreciated what I had to say, but could really challenge me from a very different perspective. And my life had been one of deep immersion in Torah study, particularly in the Talmud study, which is certainly the most demanding of the Torah study. And already from like a young age, when I was a teenager, I would spend 4 hours, 6 hours a day in front of a Talmud, just really intensely learning, following the argumentation, working it all through. And more than once when I was walking home from high school, it wasn't enough those 4 to 6 hours. I would be going over all of the arguments in my head, trying to think them through. And I would close my eyes to concentrate more, and I would wind up walking into telephone poles. I can't make this up. It really happened on a not too infrequent basis. And that is, I think, a metaphor to some degree of the learning that I did, which was super deep, super intense, but I was able to do that because I was blocking myself, like blocking out the world around me. And there were things that I wasn't seeing. And a lot of Torah learning takes place that way. A lot of Torah learning takes place in any yeshiva, but walls, it's with a chavruta, a study partner, and in theory, that really is somebody who challenges you, doesn't let you get away with your ideas. But what about this? But what about that? And you challenge them, and you come to a deeper truth. But you're actually talking to somebody, and you're in your little bubble. You're talking to somebody who shares 99.9% of the world view with you, and you're just hyper-analyzing a small point. And a lot of Torah study is also about Torah being in conversation with other parts of Torah. How does this text relate to that text? And that had been a lot of my life. It wasn't the first that I broke out of that bubble with Abby, but it was the first, I think, in a significant and a ongoing way, that both it was being in conversation with somebody who did not share a lot of my way of looking at the world, my way of looking at Torah, and that really made me see more of the world around me, and it made the Torah not just in conversation with the Torah, but it made the Torah in conversation with the world. And it's the same way, this is like an unlikely chavruta. From where I come from, Torah with Torah is the normal chavruta, and I think we created a different chavruta of Torah being in chavruta with the world, and that's really what emerged.
I'm so moved as chavruta, which obviously is built from the same root that means friend, having spawned this friendship. By a very strange coincidence, I spent a a few months in yeshiva, my junior year of college. I had not go to day school. I didn't have yeshiva background. And I decided to spend a semester studying the original text. And by weird coincidence, the first day that I was in Yeshivat HaMiftar in Efrat, they were in the page in Masechet Kiddushin that has a description of Chavruta, of two people arguing at a gate and scuffling and at each other's throats. And it's almost a violent image. And then they break through the gate, and on the other side they embrace. And that was, by providence perhaps, the first text. I was literally studying my first day in yeshiva, and it seems like there was probably a lot of sacred grappling between the two of you, and a deep friendship that emerged. And one of the many remarkable things that I find about both of you is that you do a type of empathic listening, which is rare in our society, listening not only to retort, not only to push back and to defend, but listening to really take in the other one's full reality, which means that you probably have a pretty profound understanding of the other person's Judaism, which is very different than your own. Could I ask either of you, each of you, to describe what animates your Chavruta's practice, belief structure, and commitment to Jewish life and practice? I'd love for you to praise or at least describe the other one's Judaism.
You want me to start? I mean, I think what's extraordinary about Dov, in addition to his encyclopedic knowledge, and that's not, false hyperbolic praise. It really is kind of extraordinary, which doesn't mean he doesn't have to look things up. But just the facility is uncanny, and he's known for that, by the way. He did college in a year, right? Am I right? They now have a Dov Linzer rule at his school. You can't do that anymore. So that's not just daunting as the learner, the journalist, the questioner that I am. Believe me, and I'm not saying this with false humility, I have authentic humility that I'm coming at this without smicha, without scholarship, without having done anything with the two people on my right and left have done. What I hope I channel is many Jews in this country who sometimes have assumed that ship has sailed in terms of, am I entitled to this document? Am I entitled to this conversation? Do I even know where to start? And what I would say is extraordinary about Dov's Judaism, in addition to everything you would assume, which is that he prays 3 times a day and keeps kosher strictly and obviously Shomer Shabbos and is, even when we're traveling now, it's a conversation and maybe a book by itself. It's really been interesting to go to Reform synagogues with him and to go to Orthodox synagogues. I mean, we're discovering how we move through the world. We've never traveled together. We've barely had a meal together, frankly. We do everything differently. The food, the travel, the fact that I can leave after an event on Saturday and he's going to have to sleep over. I mean, these aren't hardships, but they are differences. And I would say that one of the other things that was fundamental that I realized as we were going through this book is not just his generosity. And he was never like, let me teach you, oh, Reform Jew, about this thing that you're starting at A when I've been at M. His questions to me were genuine. I felt like he actually did want my take, and that when I pushed him on something, often because I didn't understand it or I was kind of coming up against something that I couldn't reconcile, he felt like it was an important pushback. It wasn't just for the sake of Abby stamping her foot and saying, I don't get this, I don't like this. There was kind of a respect and a tzimtzum, if you know that term, to like, you have something here to offer. And it's part of what I hope is the message of this book, is that obviously that's not a Pollyannish kind of approach. Everyone is entitled to this book. And it's the reason why it is endured, I think, is because we find ourselves in it. The last piece I would just say that is a major gulf, but has to be acknowledged, is that he feels obligated to this text in a way that I don't. I feel like it's a sacred text. I revere it. I have to wrestle with it, but I don't feel commanded by it. And I saw that he does. And that means that often in our conversations, he had to get to the good outcome. He had to respect or embrace or be able to have sort of the moral of the story had to be positive. Where sometimes I just was like, that's never going to be positive, and I'm never going to see kind of the good outcome of this parable or this verse or this moment. And that's just an interesting impasse to see going through it.
Well, thank you, and I will say that I think that I didn't know a lot really about. We knew each other through our conversations. You sort of mentioned Chavruta can have a study partner without being the friendship, and our friendship developed over the years. But I think I really started more fully understanding and appreciating and seeing sort of what animates Abby and Abby's religiosity as this project really continued. And Abby, I'll talk about you in the third person if that's okay. I'm not going to look at you, but anyway. But Abby has just a really profound thirst for Jewish connection, for Torah, for Jewish community, and also a profound work ethic and commitment. Like sometimes, you can have that thirst and say, oh, if only I had, had the privilege of a certain background or of an education, it's too bad. But you have devoted your life to your Jewish path, and by bringing really the professional life. The first book that Abby did about Stars of David was part of an exploration, conscious or subconscious, of her own Jewish identity by speaking to all of these famous Jews about their Jewish background, their Jewish knowledge, their Jewish identity. And it kept on, moving from there. All of the interviewing and the moderating that she does with these major Jewish figures. You're a lifelong learner. Everything that you do, I see, in your professional life is a form of learning Torah and learning Yiddishkeit and connecting Jewishly. I would say that, now I lost my train of thought, excuse me.
You were talking about how great I am.
We were talking about you. Oh yes, I wanted to mention two things I think significant, which is the deeper I got to see this in Abby, I was reminded of what Rambam Maimonides says about the mitzvah to love God. We're reading the Parshas Lech Lecha, and God speaks to Abraham and says, Lech Lecha, go to the land. And then in those opening verses, it says, he went and he called in the name of God, and he went and he called in the name of God. And there's a verse in the prophets that says, Abraham, my beloved one, the one who loves me. And Maimonides says, what is love of God? Love of God is you are so passionate about God. It's like somebody, like a man who's in love with a woman, and he just is so enamored and so passionate. He has to be telling everybody about this amazing woman. So everywhere Abraham went, he called out in the name of God. He just had to tell everybody about the God that he believed in and the God that he had found. And that's who I think really, Abby, that's who you are, because so much of your path, you are so passionate about Torah and Jewish connection and Jewish community, and you want to share it with everyone.
Thank you. I just want to add one thing, though, about the controversy that Dov has also weathered, because some people don't realize he is considered an authority in the modern Orthodox community, at least on the East Coast. I don't know if you're national, but people turn to him as who someone weighs in, particularly on anything that develops in our society, in modern life, that obviously has to be adjudicated in terms of halakha. But when I was I did a piece for New York Magazine on the first ordained woman in Orthodoxy, Sarah Hurwitz. It was back in 2009. And it was a firestorm in the Orthodox world, an absolute firestorm. The pressures on, and basically, tell it very condensed, Rabbi Avi Weiss, who was the person who brought Dov in to create and start Chovevei Torah, had decided that he was going to ordain the first woman, and Rabbi Sarah is extraordinary, but it really was groundbreaking to the point of like a bridge too far for many people. And the vitriol was unlike anything I could believe in the Jewish world. What was coming at her, what was coming at Rabbi Avi Weiss. And it was very, I think, a tricky place for Dov. We haven't talked about this publicly, but I interviewed him when I was reporting that, and I could see that he was navigating it in a way where he had his own red lines. Chovevei Torah, it just educates men. It's not, even though it is very open and inclusive in terms of finding ways for women to participate and be teachers and be part of observance. The lines are the lines, and he hasn't really budged on those lines. But there was such compassion in terms of what Rabbi Sarah was going through, what the women who she was ultimately modeling how they were going to follow her. And Maharat, which is now, as some of you may know, the seminary for women is 15 years old now, and has 100 and something women in the field. So it's just another way that I have seen him navigate incredibly difficult third rails and do it in a way where everyone still kind of stays with him, in that he's not abandoning anyone, but he's also not abandoning his observance and his Torah.
Thank you.
Let me sharpen that question, that point a bit, because it's not at all obvious or a given that any or even many in the Orthodox world, for understandable reasons, would countenance, would stomach a deep dive into Torah with someone who doesn't understand the origins or the profundity or the impact of Torah in the same way that an Orthodox Jew would, right? It's not a given at all. It takes a certain amount of courage to do that and not leap away from the Orthodoxy that holds you and that you've influenced as well, but also holds you. I was telling them before that when I was a rabbi in New York and I would daven in a Satmar community, because we didn't have a daily minyan in our synagogue, and the Satmars are their own thing, right, which you could have a whole session on. When I would daven in one of the minyanim, one of the people who ran that minyan, when I was there, that person would give me an aliyah to the Torah, which I thought was pretty amazing, given what I thought that person thought of me. But if that guy was not there and his number two was in charge, not only would I not get an aliyah to the Torah, I would not be counted in a minyan, right? And however much it hurt, I understand the concept. What does orthodoxy mean? Orthodoxy, the word, means a certain singular understanding of what is real and what is true, what is acceptable, and there are red lines. So I'm wondering what kind of pushback, if any, you've gotten from colleagues, from members of your extended community, about calling and elevating Abby as a chavruta worthy of a serious discussion of Torah. Was there any such pushback on this project?
Thank you. Yes, so, I think that type of orthodoxy that is very much about putting up walls and with a focus on who's out and who has to be kept at a distance and who is a threat. That is why our rabbinical school started 25 years ago, was to be an answer to that type of an orthodoxy. And, the phrase that Avi Weiss quoted, who was the founder of the rabbinical school, was it's an open orthodoxy. The way I like to talk about it is it's one that is committed to building bridges, not to building walls, and that really believes that we have to be open to all people. We have to be open to the world, that we can be, like, if you're coming from a position of fear, you have to build a wall to protect yourself from those threats. If you're coming from a position of confidence, then you want to be engaging, and that we have to be really modeling something different. And the rabbis we put out there, I believe, have really been putting that out there in the world. So I would say, in terms of the question about pushback, I've been getting 25 years worth of pushback for the rabbinical school that I had, because of so many of the Orthodox community that don't believe in any of the types of ways we are connecting to the larger world around us, creating greater space for women within the synagogue, within religious leadership, open to LGBTQ. Again, we have to navigate certain understandings of halacha, but as much as maximally possible, believe in engaging in the other denominations. So I've suffered a lot of attacks and grief over the year for exactly that. So I think that most of the people that would have attacked me for this have already attacked me and given up on me. So there was nothing left to say. But what I will say is that that I surprised myself in terms, because for me, I believe we should be learning from everyone. There's a phrase about the wise person is the one who learns from everyone. And not that I consider myself wise, but I think I know what I think. I want to know what other people think, right? And you don't have to be afraid that engaging in that conversation will affect you in a negative way. But what I wound up, so to me it was okay, of course I'm going to talk with Abby. We have interesting conversations and I learn things from those conversations and I grow from them. But we were right at the beginning of our book tour. We were being interviewed by Jody Rordan from the Forward, and she said, "So I understand you're going to be going to you're going on a tour, and you're going to be going to Reform and Conservative synagogues on Shabbat." And I'm like, "Please don't print that." It was like, "What? I don't understand. You're doing this," and it occurred to me. I don't think I myself had realized that. If that becomes public, for some people, that's an identity issue. Obviously, I've been to Reform and Conservative synagogues, but an Orthodox rabbi spending Shabbat in a Reform synagogue, how can you really be an Orthodox rabbi? The way people create these identities, by those things. So in the end, I was glad that she asked that at the beginning, and I decided, and I surprised myself that I was worried about that, and I decided to own it and to actually go forth and say, yes, and I am going to conservative and Reform synagogues because it is more important that we connect, and we connect over Torah than we worry about these silly identity issues and markers that so often divide us.
I would just say, though, we literally dove 2 months ago when we started this book tour. We went to Atlanta first to this wonderful Reform synagogue there, and he said, "You realize I've never actually been to a Reform Shabbat." And
for Shabbat synagogue, I've been to.
Yeah, right. And afterwards, he said, "Oh, that was so beautiful." We gave the drash, and then, obviously did the davening. And he said, that was really much more kind of rigorous than I thought. There's a lot more Hebrew than I expected. And then we were supposed to go into the dinner part. We were going to eat, and he was, of course, going to have his wrapped meal in cellophane. He had better challah, by the way, which was an injustice. And we were going to answer questions. But he said, before we go to dinner, Abby, I'm just going to go finish and do my davening. And it was just one of those moments where my heart both was full and sank. Because on one level, I haven't even told him this, it was like, I'm so glad that you have this, you're being honest about what you need to do, but it was also just clear that it just wasn't enough. That sort of my brand of Judaism was just not complete for him, and that's just legally the case. But I sort of saw, no matter how much we are meeting in the middle, there's just still the gulf.
Well, I'm just pleased that you're both willing to be in a conservative synagogue on Erev Shabbat. So that's a huge jump.
After an election.
I do have to tell a very quick funny story, which is we spent so much time before we did that Shabbat figuring out how am I going to manage the microphones. So I said, I can't be a visible mic. I don't want to be talking into a mic.
It has to be on already.
It has to be already set up. I'm just going to talk to the congregation, and if a mic happens to pick it up, fine. It's not my business. We worked the whole thing out. I came in, looked, you can't even see where the mic is. Anyway, it was still like the tail end of the summer, and services began at 6:30, and we had finished our drasha, and I realized it wasn't even sunset yet.
So he was like, "I'm fine. Bring out the mic."
About any of this.
Abby, let me ask you an inverse of the question I asked Dov, because maybe I'm wrong, but I would think there might be many in the Reform world that might struggle with the idea of such a Torah-based conversation with someone that you might think has radical and not fully evolved understandings of the origin of Holy Writ and even the origin of the world, and places too many non-rational inferences into this text. Did you have any hesitation internal to you or from your crowd for going so deep in Torah conversations with an Orthodox rabbi?
Everyone in my life was supportive. I think they were a little surprised in a way that, because there's a rigor to it, there's a discipline to it, and I am approaching it almost like a journalist, where I'm preparing for these conversations. The way that the podcast worked, which is what we did between 2018 to 2020, that has now been adapted for the book and really lives on the page as the conversation that we had, was, Dov and I would have sort of a preparatory phone call, which was often kind of a little bit of a shouting match of what we wanted to focus on and what each of us thought was kind of fruitful, and where something was interesting, and where usually I said, that's not as interesting as I think you think it is, or I don't really know how we get beyond 2 sentences on something like that. It was a Hevruta of itself before the Hevruta. And when we recorded these things, we did not write a script. We really were speaking in the moment, and it was very influenced by what was happening in the world. We had the travel ban was going on, the immigration controversies were really bubbling up. We had the post-George Floyd killing and the racial reckoning there, and then the pandemic. So you can imagine how much Torah it was in every daily life in an incredible way. But I felt like I had to do a lot of homework to prepare for each of those preparatory calls. So it's a long way of saying I think people are used to my kind of fascination with this, where I think there was some concern, I would say, from people in the reform world, was that they didn't want me to just be the teach me. Mm-hmm. Because then that sort of imbalance was just it wasn't really going to be a true chavruta. And the complexity with that is that I'm often the questioner, the asker, and it's part of what I love about this rabbi here is that I don't really want to hear myself. As Dov said, I would much rather ask you a million questions. I actually wrote a series about God that Adam is in, if you haven't read it, for the forward that I wrote during the pandemic, and his is truly my favorite if you ever get to read it. I asked questions like, does God punish us, and does God love us? And he tackled the is God good, which is not an easy conversation. It's just one of the most beautiful teachings. But it's a long way of saying I'm much more comfortable asking questions. And it was often Dov who said, Abby, you're just asking me. We have to balance this out. I have to ask you too. So I think that there was a little bit of concern that I would have almost over humility to the point where it just actually wouldn't be an equal. And it isn't equal, but in the sense of obviously erudition and mastery, but I think that there was a discipline we tried to have, that there was a give and take.
Please, Dov.
I want to go back to the question you raised about coming from different places in terms of our belief of the text and the divinity of the text, or where it's coming from, and how were those barriers. Because I think what made that possible is, I never sort of said to Abby, well, the Torah says, so God says this, so how could you be saying that? Even though that's my belief, I would always say, if I was going to say something along those lines, it was, from where I stand and the way I believe and what the text is saying, and that makes all the difference. Like we recently were talking, the rabbis and the teachers in the school, about a certain student that's quite brilliant, but he's got a problem that whenever he talks, he makes these declarative statements as if this is the truth. And if he would just start by saying, I think, it would make a huge difference, right?
I just want to make sure people understanding. You're saying that if you say that this is X,
right,
you have to start with the idea that it's God-given. Is that?
I'm saying, if we were discussing a text, right, and you said, this is antiquated, this doesn't make any sense to me, I wouldn't say, you can't say that, this is from God, right? I would say, I appreciate where you're coming from, but from where I stand, I believe that this is from God, and here's how I deal with it. So I was never speaking I don't think, you could tell me if I ever did it, but I don't think I was ever speaking from on high. And, from your perspective, Abby would sometimes say God or whoever wrote this text or something like that, and which is okay. That's fine. She's, that's her perspective. I didn't have to respond to that, but she never said to me something like, Dov, I don't understand how you can see this is from God. Clearly this is a human text for reasons X, Y, and Z. So we were both very free to be true to our own beliefs, but I think did it in a way that we acknowledged they were our perspectives and we're not sort of insisting it on the other.
Let me ask one more question about pluralism before we get into some Torah-based conversations about some of the machlokot that you had on the text. I see you living out in the 21st century a version of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, studying the text together and grappling. If you get the reference, you might even be quoting one another's positions before your own, and maybe even letting your children marry one another.
We did realize that Abby's two kids are the exact same age as my two kids.
I wonder if you could...
And they're all unmarried right now.
Let's get moving here. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about where your instinct for pluralism comes from. Does it come from inside Judaism and Torah, and if so, from where? Do you primarily imbibe it from outside the tradition and you've imported it to Judaism? Are there limits? How would we know? And are there categories of Jews with whom you might not have been comfortable having this deep of engagement? Just simple stuff like that.
Jeez.
Well, I just want to say I'm impressed with the way you got 10 questions.
That was amazing. I want to turn those all back to you, Ryan.
Look, a well-known phrase in the Talmud is that there are 70 facets, shivim panim laTorah, 70 facets to the Torah. Elu ve'elu, the Hillel and Shammai, these and these are the words of the living God. But the way that is normally understood in the Orthodox world is, okay, there are 70 facets, and what you just said is the 71st. You're not part of that. But, within this range, these and these are the words of the living God, and then there are all those things that are not. So that those texts, are not, even though they express a pluralism, they're expressing it from within a rabbinic context and amongst colleagues. So they do not necessarily lead to a pluralistic orientation. You can't assume because we have those texts, somebody's going to be just witness the realities out there. I would say that because you mentioned Hillel and Shammai, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who was the founder of the Musar movement, he actually said, how did it work out? As people know, for people who know the Hillel and Shammai, these were these two schools, and the schools of Hillel were pretty much always came up with a lenient conclusion in a matter of halacha, and Shammai always a strict conclusion. And basically what Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who is very much focused on our character traits and the human personality, he said, it can't just be that the people that happen to be part of that school, logic, like the way analytically they arrived at the decision, nothing else was a factor, and it always came out in one particular way. People clearly had something about their personality that was either more accepting or stricter, and that led them to that type of way of looking at text. And I think the same is true about, a pluralistic attitude. Like I would say for myself, the way I understand myself, that I've always had a certain curiosity and openness towards hearing other perspectives on things. And so I think I think both approaches exist within the tradition, but ultimately I think it's what you bring to it, where you're coming from.
Abby?
I would just say that this is where the journalism kind of allows me to play in the pluralistic playground, and it's just much more vibrant than just staying in my own silo. And so when I was, for instance, working on the book about the holidays called My Jewish Year, I interviewed the Aguda spokesman, who some of you may know is as right-wing as you can possibly be, Avi Shafran, who became a friend and sat with me and was helpful on that holiday, but probably is antithetical to every way I live my life. And then I interviewed Sharon Kleinbaum, who was the rabbi recently retired of CBST, who's considered the gay synagogue in New York. And that's not just for its own sake. Like, let me go to the left and go to the right. It's more that I do believe that our teachers and our wisdom are everywhere, and we cheat ourselves when we don't mine the Judaism and the wisdom that's in all of it. And we can decide what we discard or not, but you just never know what's going to kind of ignite an idea or a feeling or, frankly, the spirituality. And I just think it's so much richer. I love where I am. I'm at Central Synagogue. I love my rabbi, Angelo Buchdahl, and the other clergy. But I sometimes, want to go outside those walls to hear and listen. And, I'm one of those people that sermon surfs after the high holidays and listens to whoever has things online or has posted something on Facebook, because it keeps me alive Jewishly. That said, when I was doing a Hanukkah kind of panel, which I thought would be pretty benign at JTS, I invited David Ingber, who you know very well, Bert Vysotsky, who is a master teacher at JTS, Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz, who is the first ordained rabbi in Orthodox Judaism, Bruce Feiler, who wrote Walking the Bible, and Jill Hammer. I don't know if you know Jill Hammer, who does, how would you describe her? It's sort of hard to...
She's a Kohenet. She is a a spiritual waif who lives in another realm.
In the forest.
Yes.
And so I invited Avi Shafran, and I invited someone from Chabad, and Chabad was just, and I have a relationship with the press guy there, and he was just clearly dodging. Oh, this sounds so interesting. That's so interesting. Who else is going to be on the panel? Long story short, I asked Avi Shafran, and he wrote me this unbelievable email that I quoted in the book. And it basically said exactly what you were saying, where you were saying that to dignify another rabbi, any of those people, as being authentically a Jewish leader is something I cannot do. I cannot walk on that stage. And it was just one of those moments where for all of my pluralism, it's so wonderful, everybody's a teacher, it was like that gate just came down. It's like, no, Abby, that's the red line. And it was deflating to me, and I am naive there. I just thought, really, you can't be in conversation with these people?
Do you have no red lines?
That's a good question. That's for my Jewish therapist. I have difficulty being with someone who actually thinks that women just are not ever going to have. It's not even just equality in a feminist way. It's Jewishly. It's like you're just never going to share the space, breathe the air we breathe. And I know when I'm in that situation, and that's hard for me. But, I'm still interested in it, but it's where my gate comes down.
Yeah. Let's talk some Torah a second. Is that okay, Dov?
Excellent.
If we haven't lost people.
If you
Are we supposed to give people food?
Are we? Not in this sanctuary. If you haven't bought and read the book yet, you'll be able to do so on the way out. And it's really a romp through Torah, which is the source of this friendship conversation. So let's talk Torah. In Parshat Vayeshev, you seem to have a really significant disagreement about Ruvain and how we judge him and his comportment with his brothers. Was he showing tremendous courage in the encounter with Yosef and in that narrative, or did he fall kind of inexcusably short as an older brother and as the Bechor? Can you each share out where you saw that narrative and where you disagreed with your dear friend on it?
Well, so the story is that, when Joseph is sent to check up on his brothers, the 10 brothers that are out with the sheep, and after he has managed to get them quite jealous of him telling the stories of his dreams. So the verse says that, they saw, who hears the dreamer, look, he's coming. Let's kill him and say that an animal has devoured him. And then it says that, Ruvain rose up and saved him from their hands. I'm pretty much exactly what the verse says. And he says, no, let us not take a life. Let's cast him into, one of the pits and just leave him there. And so they listen to him and they cast him into a pit. And then he goes off scene. It says that these traders were passing by, the Midianites, and they sold him to the Midianites. They brought him down to Egypt. We know the story. And then it says, and Reuven returned to the pit, and behold, Joseph wasn't in the pit. So, where the heck was Reuven, right? Where was he when all that was happening? So, why don't you pick up, Avi, about your take?
Yes, I just felt like that wasn't courage to me. This is your brother, and you're allowing him to languish in this pit where he clearly isn't going to be able to get out without help. And you've been part of this kind of Lord of the Flies moment of abandoning him in this plot. And it just felt callous and cruel. And the idea that Reuven was some hero because he kept him from the worst fate just felt like fairly meh version of bravery to me. And Dov really pushed back.
Right. So I think we all agree that Reuven could have done a lot more. And I think and I want to also say that I don't take the approach of, we have to make sure that every one of our forefathers and foremothers and every major character in the Torah was the greatest tzaddik. I am completely prepared to say, look at their failings and that the Torah wants us to learn from their failings. But I feel that I don't want to take away from that story, let's beat up on Reuven and say what a complete, failure that was. Yes, it was a failure. But also, if he hadn't done anything, they would have killed him. he had the courage to stand up against 10 brothers and say, or 9 brothers, and say, let's not kill him. And maybe he felt that if he would have done something else, he would have said, let's actually really try to return him to the father. He wouldn't have accomplished anything. So he did a half measure, but a half measure was maybe all he could have done or believed he could have done, and it accomplished something. It prevented him from being killed. Now, he should be criticized about the fact that he didn't follow through, where the heck did he go? But I feel, I guess, that in a world in which it is so easy to be a bystander and it is so easy to do nothing, like we're better by acknowledging, by praising, look, at least he did something. He stepped forward. It made a difference. He could have done a lot more. But I'd rather that be the message.
And would you be proud of your sons? Is that the lesson?
I wouldn't be proud of the fact that they walked away, but I would be much prouder than had they done nothing. So, again, I think we can both acknowledge it was
something
positive and something negative. And the question is, and maybe this is the rabbi in me. I feel we do better when we say, even with his failings, what can we learn? We can learn that in a world of bystander, it's better to do something that's a half measure rather than no measure. I don't know where we get by focusing on the criticism of what he didn't do.
Is that also damning him with faint praise and low expectations? Is it Noach being righteous because amongst the other Nachschleppers in his generation he was not nearly as yucky?
Right.
Or do you actually see something noble in being slightly above the ignoble fray?
Thank you, Rabbi Kligfeld.
Was that a question or a statement?
Okay. Shabbat shalom.
With the Noah story, I actually think that both are true. I think that when we are in a community, in a society, which people, which is a better one, we ourselves are elevated. And actually, he might not have been great had he lived in the time of Abraham, but had he lived in the time of, compared to Abraham, but had he lived in the time of Abraham, he might have turned out to be even a greater person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a simpler text, the Sota. Dov, can you describe that parak of Bamidbar? Where and how you reached an impasse with Abby on it. And I'm going to ask each of you to share what you're most proud of what you learned about that text from the other and what you're most proud you may have taught the other about that text.
That is interesting.
So the Torah, this is in Numbers in Naso, the second parsha. It says that if a husband suspects his wife of adultery, and the text is quite clear that it's without any basis, it says a spirit of jealousy comes over him, and he suspects his wife of adultery, that what he is told to do is to take his wife to the priest in the temple. I mean, it was the tabernacle, but we'll say the temple. And she is made to undergo a very degrading ritual. Her hair is disheveled, which was seen as public shaming. They write out curses on a piece of parchment, which basically says if you slept with another man, not your husband, all of these curses will befall you. Your thighs will collapse. Your stomach will distend. And the sense is like where we assume sort of that you've done it. And then these curses are scraped out. The ink is scraped into some water, which is also mixed with some dirt, and she has to drink this. So it's pretty horrific. And why don't we go to what your reaction is?
We could basically,
Abby.
Yes, and now it's time for, horrific is the word. And I felt like this is a fairly irredeemable moment. And part of it was, first of all, not that there would ever be justification, but it really felt almost there was no basis for this accusation, and on top of it, it felt like gratuitous humiliation. And so I felt like this is just one of those texts that, you can say it's of its time, but you can't extract the good lesson from this. And there have to be moments where we just say this is awful. Over to you, Dov.
So, not just in my conversation with Abby, I had learned this text for many years, and I think, different from probably many Orthodox Jews, not just Orthodox rabbis, who would not allow themselves to entertain the real problems that this text presents. It's all from God, we can't question it, and don't ask questions. I actually am very honest with myself and say, this is horrific, this is not consistent with my values, but I can't let it stop there, because I believe it's from God, and I believe that God is good. And I have to find a way to both be honest with my own sense of morality and consistent with my belief in the Torah. So how am I going to reconcile it? And that's something that I've asked myself, over the years with this text. And the best answer that I was able to come to for myself was it's based on a teaching of Maimonides, which, again, for most Orthodox Jews would consider this heretical, even though Maimonides says it, but it can be very threatening. What he says is that even though, he says this in the context of animal sacrifices, he says, even though the Torah was given for all time, it was also given at a particular time. And people were not always ready for the full truth. They were not always ready for the ultimate way in which they should be living their lives. Animal sacrifices, is what he says, is not the best way to worship God. But people weren't ready for that message yet. So God put them on the right path. And I think we can see this about slavery. I think the total message of the Torah, I took you out of the house of bondage, is that there should not be any slavery in society. But the Torah does not eradicate slavery. It tries to make it, I can't even say the words more humane, but a better institution. And it took us 3,000 years till we got rid of slavery from the time the Torah was given. So to believe that things are not the end point, they're putting us on a path. And I use that, I'll call it a strategy, that approach in dealing with something like this. And so my read is that, we're dealing in a patriarchal society where in other societies of the time, if a husband had such a suspicion, he could probably have his wife summarily executed. So the Torah maybe feels that the husband's prerogative at this stage, he shouldn't have this prerogative, but cannot be at this stage where people are taken away. So what we're going to do is set up a test that she is definitely going to come out innocent. Because if God does not intervene, it says if her stomach extends and her thighs fall, then that proves she's guilty. But if nothing happens, if no miracle happens, she's innocent. So it's a test that is made for her to succeed, and then he gets to have his jealousy put to rest, and they get to go home happy. To which Abby said, I am so happy for him, that his prerogative was not threatened.
But to the question, I would say that what I learned from this, if there is a silver lining, was just, I do think what is true is we've seen so much, even in American society, in history, that just things have had to move slowly, that the prophetic voices were often too soon and too agitational, but they put something in motion that led to a better place. And that sometimes things just really do take that much time. And if I saw this as an incremental step forward, I could somehow get my head around the idea that this was early on in a process to a more just kind of, I don't know how to finish the sentence, but I do understand that things go slowly, and that sometimes the things that are anathema to us, I could look at a lot of things in America that were anathema. My mother is, as some of you may know, was a founder of Ms. Magazine, and with Gloria Steinem. And when I did a story on the founding of Ms., I went back to the archives of the opposition to Ms. In 1972, and it would shock the conscience what was said about these women, about this magazine. It's things I don't want to say in front of anyone young here. It was horrific. And I kind of thought, okay, there was some resistance to a magazine and feminism, and it was truly rending a society at the time. And so that's just a way of saying I can get my head around slow movement.
Well, I don't think this is the first actually that I am hearing that you're a little bit open to this, because I do know that in the book, and
I'm trying.
I appreciate that, but what I learned though was something that I feel that I've solved in my head. It's like when you expose it to the light of day, it's like, no, that's still pretty horrific. And And your reaction, at the time was, Dov, you are so pretzeling yourself to make this work, and I appreciate where that's coming from. This is what you said, that your deep commitment to the text as being from God and what your orientation is, and, I can really respect that, but you think you've solved this text, and with all of your pretzeling, it still remains horrific. And for me, that was a learning, because we think things make sense in our own minds when we're only talking to ourselves, and then it's like, no, from the outside perspective, I have to be honest that I really haven't solved the text.
Well, I like to say that what you both just shared is magnificent and all too rare, because those are true shifts from your initial locus points on a challenging text. If it's not a challenging text, then you're not an interesting person, right? But those are true moves that only would have happened through the openness that you both gifted to one another, and really gifted to anyone who's exposed to this dialogue. Let me ask one more Torah-based question. My mind has been in Parshat Mishpatim for a long time, because my son's becoming bar mitzvah in February this year in Parshat Mishpatim. And Mishpatim speaks a lot about the ger, the stranger, and how you define who the stranger is and isn't impacts to whom you think the Torah says we have an obligation to not mistreat. And I understand you had a bit of a debate as to who is and who is not in that category halachically, conceptually, and claiming us and that aspect of our Jewish conceptual generosity. Can you flesh that out a bit?
That's a great sentence. I would just start, this was very hard for me, because I was raised, I'm definitely to the right of my mother, but that's very easy right now. But I was raised at a Seder table where this was all about obligation and responsibility to the stranger, to the other, to the person unlike us, that we have been raised with these values that came out of the Jewish story. And because we were essentially oppressed, we can make sure no one else is. And that may just sound like a cliche, but it really was a very deep orientation of my childhood. And I would say, when we were having one of our chavruta about the Seder, and I said, wasn't the core idea of your Haggadah, Dov, this idea of welcoming the stranger? And he said, with all due respect, Abby, that's not in the Haggadah. And I said, what do you mean? He said, the core statement of the Haggadah is, in every generation, our enemy rises up to destroy us. And that's, I'm laughing about it now, but post October 7th, that conversation has come back, roaring back into my head. I'm suddenly like, this is my new Haggadah. He was right. As horrific as that is horrific, I'm overusing that word. But what I would say that was really hard about our conversation, and it lives on the page, is that Dov will explain why he said essentially the ger is still a Jew. Is the convert. In the traditional rabbinic reading, the ger is the convert, which essentially means it's still our family. And I said, wait a second, are you saying that there isn't an orientation to the true stranger, the true outsider? And he's kind of like, not so much really. And the reason why this was an important conversation was because very often when we talked about Torah values, it still felt like it was insular. Like the message that Dov was kind of saying is that we're supposed to do all the charity, all the care, all the not putting a stumbling block before the blind, and all of these things for other Jews.
Just to be clear, this was how the rabbis read the text. I totally acknowledge that the simple meaning of the text is much more universal, but I was sharing with Abby the traditional rabbinic reading makes all of those universal texts very insular.
Which
and
was
that
kind of
observant
shattering.
Jews don't observe the Torah. We observe the Torah as refracted through the rabbinic imagination, right. Which is a strange thing to say, but it's a thing to say. Right.
So that was eye-opening and kind of dispiriting for me.
Yeah, and I see sometimes that the role I play in the Orthodox community is to to bring that voice and the voice of the simple meaning of the text and say, we have been reading this halachically in this narrower way, and I can understand why that developed. You living in societies, living under oppression for so long does not, having as a lot of us have experienced post-October 7th. Having universalist values is a luxury of acceptance and a certain position we hold in society. And when you're feeling oppressed, it's, circle the wagons. So I can understand why the rabbis read the text that way, and that has become our halacha. And I would sometimes, again, when I'm talking in the Orthodox context, say, but we have to get back to the ethos here of the more universalist ethos. And at least that should be somewhat of a counterbalance, or at least somewhat in tension. And I think what happened, both that Abby was just so shocked to hear how all of these universalist texts had been narrowed, was, exactly this issue about how after October 7th, like Abby, I think had come I
got more tribal.
Yeah.
Well, it can be shocking and illuminating to crawl back to Pshat, the simple meaning of the text, if you've inherited Drash, if you've inherited the rabbinic transmutation of our text into practice and narrative. Right. It can be illuminating and shocking to go back to what it might originally have meant. Michael Goodman notably says that the Torah's internal memory of the story of Exodus was not, you were taken advantage of, make sure you're never in that situation again, even though the rabbis say that about that story in the Haggadah. The Torah's internal memory is, since you were stranger in a strange land, don't you ever be the oppressor. Don't you allow yourself to be the Pharaoh. That's what it says in Torah. But it's not the only or even the grandest thing that the rabbis say we should be doing when we're wielding that message in our Jewish practice. So I love the fact that you crawled back to Pshat, or an attempt at it, because our tradition really venerates both. But sometimes rabbinic Jews get a little bit too enamored with what the rabbis once said the text has to mean. Right. But we're going to ask one more question before I open up to the Kahal to ask some questions. Before I do so, I want to thank Ikar and Isaiah for sponsoring this event, and also B'nai David Judea, and welcome my dear friend and colleague, Rav Yosef Kaneski. Always an honor to have you in the building and be present for a conversation of Torah. Thank you for being here, Rav Yosef. Let's presume, I think accurately, that you're in a room filled with budding Torah scholars who are waiting to do yet more Torah study in their lives compared to what they've done now. What's your message to them, given what you've experienced in this process, in this project?
I think I would start with, try to find an unlikely chavruta. That to me has been what has been just so rich about what we have done, and really cultivate a sense of a curiosity of moving out of your comfort zone and allowing yourself to be challenged, and someone in which you can have a respectful relationship and will allow to be challenged back.
I agree with that, and I would also just say, kind of now more than ever. I've seen there's so much to say about the post-October 7th reckoning for Jews. So much of what I see in my community, and these are educated people who care tremendously and are very much learners, but there's often been a sense of wanting to sort of outwardly show more Jewish identity. And sometimes I think what I wish they would do is kind of go back to the book and not just wear the Jewish star and put up the mezuzah and go to the protest or sign something or post something. But let's have more of us go back to this incredible story and these incredible words that are challenging but have been the glue of our people for a reason.
Amen.
Thank you.
Let's start with a round of applause, because that was amazing. Thank you. And let's open up a little bit. I'd love to hear some questions from people in the Kahal, and I'd love to hear at least one question from someone under the age of 20. Yeah. Because it's so great to have some of the youth of our community here.
Amazing.
But who wants to start off with a question for Abby and or Dov? Who's that? Stevie.
Decade or so, but certainly since the last Abigail cycle started in 2020, is a lot of people sort of figuring it out on their own, right? Just getting Arsenal or Shine Salts, which is available for free online, and sort of trying to delve into the text, but doing it without sort of partnering with someone from a different perspective. And I just I'm wondering, how do you feel about that phenomenon, and what would you want to tell us?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, that I just want to say, like, that the idea of how many people are doing the Daf Yomi shows how one small idea can be completely transformative. 100 years ago, one rabbi came up with an idea that we should study a page of Talmud every day, and now the amount of people that are learning Talmud on a daily basis and are in a sort of conversation, virtual or actual, with everybody else, sort of engaged in this, to me, that just shows you, by the way, how an idea can change the world.
Pause 1 second. Anyone in the room, raise your hand if you're doing Daf Yomi or have done. All right, I got one. Good. Two. Okay.
One of the podcasts, as was mentioned, that I do is the Daf Yomi podcast. So if you want, you can. If you love hearing my voice so much, you can hear it every single day. Anyway, and I also think that, there was a resistance in the Orthodox community for many, many years in translating the Talmud. Like, this is elite, you have to, we're going to protect it, and only if you're at a certain level can you engage in it. And and the people that broke that taboo and translated it, and what that has done to make this accessible. So I think we should just take a moment to appreciate just how much this has become at least available for those who want to engage in it in ways that it hasn't. And just all the podcasts, there's a podcast of Daf Yomi by women, for women. I mean, there's just so many different types of options around that. You don't always have the opportunity to study with a chavruta. People where do you find the hour a day if you want to do the Daf Yomi? People are commuting to work. They're listening to it on their iPhone. It's really challenging. So I guess my response would be, even though I think that would be ideal, we should do what we can when it comes to Torah study. We shouldn't sell it. We shouldn't not do something because we can't be doing it the best way.
Like Ruvain.
What? I'm sorry, what?
Like Ruvain.
Yes. Excellent point.
It always comes back to Ruvain.
Next question. Who's that guy? I can't see who it is.
Hi.
Here, stand up so we can all hear the question.
What are what in Judaism? Oh, red flags.
Or
red lines.
Red lines. I mean, look, in terms of my own personal observance, I got a lot of red lines. I mean, living the life of halacha, there's a lot. It's pretty much many, many things you have to do, you can't do, and so on. In terms of engaging in conversation, I think what made this possible was that we didn't make it uncomfortable for the other person to be in the room. So even though Abby is coming with a different understanding of Torah than I am, if she were like regularly referring to the documentary hypothesis, the idea that the Torah is man-made document, if an author is JEPD.
That's really confusing.
Was that very confusing? Sorry. Okay. Those who, for the classic academic understanding of, in the academy, not within religious circles, is that the Torah was a composite document, the 5 books of Moses, with different sections of it, but pieces of it were written by different authors at different times, and it was put together in this composite way. And then this approach would identify, this verse is from the author that's referred to as J, and then the verse afterwards is from the author that's referred to as E. And this is a classic approach in the academy. So if we were looking at a text and Abby was saying, well, what do you expect? That's a J text. Of course, that's why it's going to say that. Like, we couldn't have learned together. That just makes me, I
never did that.
I respect people. I respect that perspective, but it just makes me so uncomfortable to be having a conversation where that's constantly being referred to and taken for granted, and it's just pushing my buttons. So I guess the point is, there are a lot of red lines for me in terms of my own belief and observance. In terms of engaging somebody else, I think you got to know your triggers and the things that won't make it possible for you to be in the room.
I think my only red line, and I'm not sure you were asking me, would have been if there's something I cannot ask him. That's where it's the first time anyone's ever asked me that, but I think that's where this just wouldn't have, it's not just that it wouldn't have kind of sung, which it really did, but even when we clashed, I felt like I had permission to ask the thing I really wanted to know. And I wasn't pushing just to be challenging and agitational and provocative. It was because I was really sometimes stuck or really confused or really wanting to ask something. And I feel like Dov gives permission for that as long as it's done in a way that respects, again, his commitments.
Yeah.
I mean, I can start. I would just say I really had never thought about what it would mean to feel like every word is divine. Like that is a big idea for me, and that's really new. And I just sounded like such a New Yorker. That's really new. I feel like Dov sounds like a New Yorker. You do, right?
Not a native New Yorker.
Really? He's absorbed. He lives in the Bronx. But I think that's such a great question.
Riverdale is in the Bronx.
Malka. Oh, that's such a wonderful name. So I think it wasn't just new when we were doing this, but it's still something I'm not just wrestling with, but kind of absorbing, because that's just so foreign to me.
You know, I would say, and maybe it's not exactly answering the question, but Abby made me appreciate some practices in ways that I had not appreciated them before, and actually give me the opportunity, because I meant to say this at the question way at the beginning about the other, you know, our take on each other, you know, about a real. I think sometimes there's a real problem again, I feel like I'm ragging a lot on the Orthodox community, but there can sometimes be a problem among some circles where it's like, oh, you know, where I'm religious, you're not religious. And, meaning you don't keep my halacha the way I keep halacha. And what I often will respond to that is actually, first of all, what you meant to say was, I'm observant and you're not observant, because you're not talking about religiosity, and religiosity is a real problem, and there are plenty of observant Jews who are not religious and vice versa. But you actually, even then you should say you observe differently than I do. You should not be saying I observe and you don't observe. And I think that because of where Abby comes from, you know, she comes with real intentionality in terms of observance and the way she observes, and some issues, like one of the things that shocks people is when they hear that I don't like tashlich, you know. And
you believe that?
I'm not sure I would have gone ahead with this program if I knew that, Deborah. That's them's fighting words.
Wait a minute. And Abby is like, wait a minute, you're an Orthodox rabbi, you have to do tashlich. And it's late.
But not only that, I love tashlich.
Right. First I say, it's after the Talmud, it's a late practice, I don't really believe in it. And I was, what are you talking about? And then we realized, not in the book, even in the conversations after, it's because the way, you know, I've always been, tashlich has been done in my community, is very like just say the verses, throw the bread, walk home, and it's very not meaningful, as opposed to the way Abby.
I like put a sin on every crumb.
With real intentionality. I mean, even when Abby shared with me how she says Moda'ani in the morning, what she thinks about, you know, with the prayers at night. And it made me deeply appreciative of a certain intentionality that I'm, you know, not always part of my practice.
Thank you.
Two more questions. Ariel.
Wait, say again.
Antiquated.
Antiquated, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great question.
A great question. Great question. And it's why, you know, his question is Rambam's idea, Maimonides' idea that some of the mitzvot in the Torah are not the end point. They're the starting point. Like I mentioned, the sacrifices, but it's not the ideal form. So then does that mean that basically those are not meant to be followed now? And then how do we know which is which? And I think because of that conclusion you came to is why this idea is so threatening to so many. Because if this isn't the end point, then does it mean that it now becomes obsolete? But Maimonides never says it becomes obsolete, you know, and in his book on law, in Mishnah Torah, he has all the laws of all the sacrifices. And he says the laws always remain binding for all time. I'm not exactly sure how we reconcile that, but, as a committed halachic Jew, he on the one hand believed it's binding, and from a rational philosophical perspective, he could say, but we're supposed to get to a higher point. Maybe we keep these practices as we continue to adopt, ways in which to live our lives in an even better way. So, I didn't give you an answer because, his answer was, no, you don't drop the practices, but yes, I am still saying that these aren't the end point.
Do one more?
Figure out the answer to that. You can come back to me.
Rebecca? Rebecca, stand so we can hear you better.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, somebody asked us just the other day, I don't remember, it's all blurring a bit, but said so what in the Torah, somebody asked me this, what in the Torah made you realize that the Torah was from God? I think this was actually as we were signing books. Somebody said this to me. And I'm like, nothing in the Torah made me realize it was from God. I just grew up with that belief that was taught to me. And it was, a belief that I could have questioned. I'm not I didn't question in my own mind. I could have abandoned, but I was deep. I had already, it was like they say in my kishkas. I already deeply believed it. I was deeply invested in it. I didn't want to stop believing in it. So at least for me, it really is nurture. At the same time, some people had the same upbringing I did and did not walk away with that belief, right? It's how we absorb the messages that we're given has a lot to do with who we are to begin with. So I can't exactly answer the nurture nature, but I will say that it was not intellectual. It was something about my orientation to the text from an early age and something that it's been always very essential to who I am.
And I was just saying, thank you, Rebecca, for the question. I don't really, even though I call myself a Reformed Jew and we needed to kind of distinguish ourselves on the book cover, I came to all this late. I was raised with a very strong home-based Judaism, but I didn't belong to a synagogue in a formal way. We went, but we sometimes moved around. We sort of synagogue hopped. It was only in 2006 when my children were small that I joined a synagogue for the first time. I became a bat mitzvah at 40. I came to all of this sort of extravaganza of learning obsession really in my 30s. And, now I'm much older. But my point is that I'm on this journey where the Judaism has felt more like a choice. Even though I feel deeply Jewish my whole life, this idea of what I'm connected to and what I'm in the line of in terms of my inheritance is just very acute for me, but also very much in motion. And so I'm proud to be at Central Synagogue. I love that place, and in that sense, I am affiliated. And what I believe in terms of Reform Judaism is the idea of adapting to the modern world. And that doesn't mean a watered-down Judaism, even though obviously there's less of things. I feel like it's not so much that this is the Judaism light and that's the heavy Judaism. That's oversimplistic to me and I think facile and actually inaccurate. But what I take pride in is that this is a powerful, very proud Judaism, very committed Judaism that also manages to move through the world in a way that I think, for me at least, allows me to have both, to live in real life, what I consider to be real life, and also have just a very strong tradition as well.
If I could actually also add a final thought, more sort of, I guess, academic in me. There's an excellent book that I would recommend to people, at least the first chapter. It's by the sociologist Peter Berger, I believe is the name, and it's a great title. It's called The Heretical Imperative. So the imperative to be a heretic. And what he says is that the basic difference between the pre-modern world and the modern world is choice. That in the pre-modern world, the world and all of it was taken for granted, how to look at the world, what our role in the world would be. And the modern world is defined by the fact that we can choose anything. We can choose our gender, we can choose our career, we can choose where we're going to live, we can choose our religion. And that you can't escape, this is the imperative, and that the word heresy, its origins did not mean that you believe in the wrong thing. The word heresy, the Greek word, means choice, that you are choosing what you want to believe. You are asking yourself, do I really believe this? And that was the fundamental act in the pre-modern world of heresy. I'm not sure I believe in this. Let me decide. Let me choose. And he said, nowadays we're all heretics. Nowadays, everybody knows that you can make a different choice. And sometimes I will say to my students, like, if you were to ask somebody, why are you an Orthodox Jew? If you were to ask, right? It says, well, they would say, so they might say, well, because, it gives me community, and this is the way I was brought up, and this is why I choose to be an Orthodox Jew. Even if they don't say that, they would most likely say, because I believe that, because what do you mean? Because I believe that the Torah is from God. I said, that still betrays that they're making a choice. Because if you would ask somebody, or probably even if you ask, in the pre-modern world, he says, why am I an Orthodox Jew? Because the Torah is from God. What is the difference between saying, because I believe that the Torah is from God, and saying, because the Torah is from God? When you say, because I believe, it means you know that you could believe otherwise, right? So in a certain way, even those of us that are brought up in a certain way, we're all choosing, we're all affirming our Judaism.
And that in this era, all obligations are somewhat voluntary,
right?
And that makes it maybe harder to self-obligate, but maybe more elevated and sanctified that we choose to do so. We are grateful to you for modeling what it means to be in a respectful, substantive, rich dialogue across some meaningful cultural gaps. We're grateful that you put this out in the world so we can continue to be your students. And I'm so grateful to have you both in our sanctuary as my friends and as teachers of all of us. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Thank
all
you
of
all.
you. What a wonderful
Really.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.